Dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to thank WIDER for inviting me to present a paper written with my colleague Binaswari Bolaki, who could not attend this meeting. And the paper that I'm presenting today is titled Industrial Policy in Africa in a Changing Global Environment. Before I start the presentation, I would like to point out that a modified version of this paper formed part of a report that UNCTAD and UNIDO had published jointly in 2011. As some of you may know, every year UNCTAD produces an Economic Development in Africa report that dwells on a theme of relevance to African development. In 2011, the theme we choose centered on fostering industrial development in Africa and the new global environment. As chief of the Africa section then, I led a team at UNCTAD that collaborated with UNIDO to produce that report. What is the objective of this paper? The paper looks at the implication that a changing global environment in the 21st century may or should have on industrial policy in Africa. That is, on how Africa needs to go about designing and implementing industrial policy. More specifically, we looked at three major global forces. One is the multilateral rules that are emerging and that will affect how trade and investment will be carried out in the 21st century. The second factor is the emergence of economic powers from the South, such as China, India, as industrial warehouses. And the third factor is advancing environmental threats, such as global warming. We believe that all these three global factors will carry implications on Africa's ability to compete in the industrial world. Throughout the paper, we try to analyze the challenges that these emerging characteristics pose for the continent in terms of designing long-term viable industrial strategies and positioning itself as an industrial competitor, but we also look at the opportunity that could be derived from these global emerging forces. Before going further in my presentation, I would like to introduce three caveats in this presentation. First, in the paper, we do not attempt to provide tailor-made recommendations for given countries or sub-regions. As you know, Africa is, of course, a big, heterogeneous continent. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. Each African country will need to take its own initial condition and future potential advantage into account when designing and implementing its industrial policies. However, we believe there are certain global factors from the changing environment that will commonly impact on the international, regional, and local competitiveness of African firms in the decade ahead. This brings me to the second caveat. The paper does not dwell on the numerous challenges that Africa will have to face in order to build industrial competitiveness in the 21st century. This has already been discussed at length in other publications. The focus of this paper, rather, is to highlight how emerging changes in the global environment should affect the selective and strategic dimensions of industrial policy in Africa, while leaving it to be understood that Africa will also need to address other immediate challenges in order to kickstart a solid industrial base in its backyard. And the third caveat is that in the paper, some of our policy recommendations may seem in the sense that they may not immediately feasible or implementable. When we talk of industrial policy, we need to distinguish between long run, medium run, and short run and long run policy. In this paper, we concern ourselves with long run policies. In particular, we ask ourselves the following questions. What elements from the changing global environment should Africa take into account when framing its long-run industrial policy? At this point, I would like to cite a quotation from Ha-Hu Chang that I think highlights the importance for African industrial policy to be designed with a long-term strategic perspective in mind. I quote, "In the end, the African country will have to get into many industries that today no one, and I repeat, no one would think they can succeed in if they are going to become economically developed." End of quotation. Africa must not be afraid of thinking big if it wants to emerge as an industrial powerhouse. Let's go back to our three major global forces. Number one, emerging international trading and investment rules, how they will affect industrial policy in Africa. From two examples, most African countries are latecomers to the industrialization game, and as such, they will need to industrialize by deploying policy instruments that are strictly compatible with WTO rules. From a historical point of view, most nations have industrialized successfully by the means of highly protectionist policy. The example of Britain in the 18th century, 19th century, the East Asian NICs in the 20th century, and through preferential trade arrangement, the case of Mauritius in textile in the 90s and 80s. However, in the 21st century, there will be significantly less scope due to emerging WTO rules to implement industrialization strategies based on protectionist tariff, export subsidies, and trade preferences. While African countries need to fine-tune the design of their industrial policy according to their own circumstances, they will have to do so while operating in a more policy-constrained space. The region will need to find creative solutions to overcome hurdles toward industrialization. I would now like to spend a couple of minutes highlighting some of the implications that existing and emerging provision under WTO may have on African industrial policy. Just two examples. On tariff liberalization under the non-agricultural market access negotiation. As you know, this negotiation covered industrial and manufactured goods, and they are still ongoing, although the rhythm of negotiation is very slow now. Basically, under these rules, developing countries, with the exception of least developed countries, will need to reduce their import tariff on industrial products and bind tariff below a certain ceiling. Exemption, a whole sector from tariff cut will not be possible. This implies that for non-LDCs African countries, they will have to considerably lower their tariff, and it will be difficult for them to pursue a large-scale import substitution strategy behind high tariff barriers or through gradual and selective tariff liberalization. This is further compounded by the insertion of the clause of national treatment principle in WTO laws, whereby foreign firms and goods are to be granted the same treatment as local firms and locally produced goods once entered in the country. On the other hand, while African countries will face the opportunity to increase market access abroad for their existing industrial product, the ability to take advantage of such a market opportunity will be linked to their capacity to develop industries that are export competitive. Furthermore, currently African countries are negotiating the economic partnership arrangement with the EU. They are expected to liberalize trade in most lines of goods and services, while the finalization of EPAs is still underway for most African regional blocs and is plagued by several contentious issues. Decisions reached during this negotiation will have important repercussions on the future industrial policy space of African countries. LDC, of course, will continue to benefit from duty-free, quota-free market access for their goods to the EU, but the rest of Africa will need to compete for such markets based on real competitiveness dimensions such as price, quality, and degree of technological sophistication. So in the face of increased liberalization, what are then feasible industrial policy options for Africa? Given increased competition for traditional external market, we argue that Africa should accelerate the implementation of regional integration in order to create larger internal market for African-based products. It can use its regional free trade arrangement to foster intra-regional trade in industrial goods by granting preferential access to African products. The competitiveness of African products relative to non-African products will be further enhanced if the region were to invest massively in transport infrastructure in order to reduce intra-regional transportation costs and implement institutional reform to facilitate trade within the region. Concomitant with the policy of accelerated regional integration, African countries should target foreign investors, especially from emerging economies, to come and invest in Africa on the basis of three major attractions. First, the possibility to serve large consumer internal markets in Africa as Africa's emerging middle class grow in size. Second, the possibility to locate production close to raw materials in case of resource-based manufacturers. And third, the possibility to enter some foreign market on preferential terms. On the second example is related to intellectual property rights. African countries, in this case, they have opportunity through the TRIP agreement to secure patent over a certain type of natural raw materials that can be transformed into industrial products, and in so doing, establish a comparative advantage in the production of these products. The second element which can influence the industrial policy in Africa is the South-South trade and the rising industrial power of India and China. As the world transforms into a multipolar global economy, it remains vital for the region to deepen investment, trade, and finance relationships with non-traditional partners, such as the BRIC countries and other emerging economies, such as Malaysia, Turkey, and South Korea. Such South-South cooperation, though, should in no way be construed as a substitute for partnership with northern countries. Within the South-South partnership, Africa's relation with China and India assume paramount importance for several reasons. First, China and India can be cooperative partners as well as the main competitor to Africa in industry, especially manufacturing. Second, like most investors in Africa, Chinese and Indian interests in Africa lie primarily in exploiting Africa's natural resources, and this represents a danger in that further development in the Africa-China and Africa-India partnerships may accentuate the trend of Africa being a primary commodity exporter and an importer of manufactured goods, delaying the structural transformation that industrialization is meant to engineer. Africa's pattern of being commodity dependent in its trading relation with the North should not be replicated with its southern partners. Third, as China and India rise in the preeminence of global value chains, whether as producers or consumers, this has important implications for Africa in terms of harnessing its partnership with the two Asian countries to position itself in these global value chains. What are then the implications of China and India on Africa's industrial strategies? First, newly industrializing African countries may find it hard to engage in the traditional industrial growth trajectories based on developing first stepping stone industries such as clothing, textile, furniture, and shoes, and other low-cost segments due intense Chinese competition in those basic industrial sectors. African countries may need to adopt industrialization strategies that are from the start based on product differentiated, innovation-intensive or technology-intensive niche products that offer upgrading opportunity with a marketing strategy emphasizing quality and branding. Second, in Africa export orientation policies, Africa will have to be mixed with domestic demand-driven strategy, with the latter becoming more important as income rise on the continent and regional integration accelerators. African firms will be facing increasingly competition from India, and this kind of competition will have implications on manufacturing export market subject to increased volatility. Third, at a political level, the African continent needs to establish room for negotiating with China and India on economic-related matters, and to do so with a coordinated voice. This has been said in many forums. Fourth, Africa needs to stand ready to exploit, in turn, the large industrial market that China and India will create as its urban middle class expand in years ahead, and in China's case, as the economy shifts from an investment-led to a consumer-led model. It is estimated that by 2030, 59% of global middle class will originate from Asia, compared to 20% in 2009, due to burgeoning emerging middle class from China and India. The third element of a global factor which will affect industrial policy in Africa is the issue of global warming. We call it greening industrial growth in Africa. We said in this paper that as a latecomer to the industrial game, Africa has a unique opportunity to be at the forefront of the green industrial revolution by implementing a green industrial development based on low energy and carbon intensities. While industrially advanced countries will have to bear the cost of transiting toward a low carbon economy in the medium run, the continent has the opportunity to avoid such adjustment costs by leapfrogging directly into clean, renewable technology and energy-efficient method of production that is engaged in clean industrial development right from the beginning. To conclude, Mr. Chair, as I said, the paper highlights potential factors shaped by the changing global environment that African countries will need to take into account when designing and implementing their medium and long-run dynamic industrial policies in the 21st century. As the rule of the trade and investment game get defined at the WTO, in a climate prone to increased trade liberalization, African countries should accelerate effort at deepening regional integration and using the regional market as experimental grounds for breaking into global markets. African countries need to rally around regional industrial policies that are coherent with their national industrial policy and that foster the creation of regional value chains, while also strategically market Africa, in particular African LDCs, as an entry point for exporting to other destinations. It is also necessary to strengthen the capacities of African officials at making use of WTO provisions to safeguard Africa's strategic industrial interest. How to create and market a Made in Africa brand must form part of Africa regional industrial strategic thinking in the 21st century. In addition, African countries must not be afraid of thinking big. African countries must, from now and on, sow the conditions for nurturing competitiveness at supplying green industrial products targeted at environmentally conscious consumers, producing niche quality products for high-end consumers, and exploring opportunities for integrating into Southern-led global value chain. I thank you.